Glad to have this opportunity to be with you this morning and for the invitation of the lecture committee to speak on the program this year. I always anticipate the West Virginia School of Preaching lectures because of all of the good men that I get to see and visit with, and students that come back, alumni, and various others that come and visit our services. We usually try to keep track of all the different congregations that come our way during the lectureship, and we usually have 85 to 90 congregations throughout West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania and other places that attend our lecture program. So we have a good representation of people through the years, and they are a good source of support and help to us, and we appreciate them so much, not only for their attendance, but for the good help that they give throughout the year. This is our fourth book on the minor prophets. In 2002, we had a full lectureship on the book of Zephaniah. In 2004, we did Hosea, Joel, Amos, and Obadiah. In 2006, we did Nahum, Habakkuk. No, we did, well, whatever the next four. Where did I leave off? Jonah, Micah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. And then this year we finish up with the final three, Zephaniah, Haggai, and Malachi. Bruce's lesson also is on the book of Zephaniah, and by the time we finish, we will have dissected the book of Zephaniah. 3 chapters, but we have had several lessons on it. Of course, there is some overlap, but that simply is another way of teaching us and reminding us of these truths. Denver said that he gets confused about all these CDs and DVDs and all of that, but when he starts trying to sell the BVDs, then we need to be careful. My theme today is no fear of the Lord, and I would like to read from the text in Zephaniah chapter 3, the first 7 verses. And we will try to develop our thought from those particular verses, and hopefully that we will derive some good from it. The prophet says, "Woe to her that is rebellious and polluted, to the oppressing city. She obeyed not the voice, she received not correction, she trusted not in Jehovah, she drew not near to her God. Her princes in the midst of her are roaring lions, the judges are evening wolves, they leave nothing till the morrow. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons, her priests have profaned the sanctuary, they have done violence unto the law. Jehovah in the midst of her is righteous, he will not do iniquity. Every morning doth he bring his justice to light, he faileth not. But the unjust know no shame. I have cut off nations, their battlements are desolate. I have made their streets waste, so that none passed by. Their cities are destroyed, so that there is no man, so that there is no inhabitant. I said, only fear thou me, receive correction, so her dwelling shall not be cut off, according to all that I have appointed concerning her. But they rose up early and corrupted all their doings." And so the phrase, no fear of God, is the opposite of what God wanted. He said that he wanted them to fear him. You know, Job says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or the Proverbs. And so throughout the Bible, the proper understanding of the fear of God is essential for every person that wants to really, truly submit to the Lord. And when we fail to fear God, then everything else is going to go by the wayside as well. Without the fear of God, men become perverted in their assessment and judgment of God's law and His will, whatever age we live in. And certainly we are facing a situation in our time where there is an obvious no fear of God. When we think about the context of Zephaniah, the pronouncement of the book is concerning the downfall of Jerusalem and Judea, and that is expressed through the phrase, the day of the Lord, that was developed so well yesterday evening. And then in chapter 1, the prophet gives a declaration of retribution. And the hellfire and brimstone that is being poured out that is to be poured out upon the city of Jerusalem and its inhabitants is very much needed as far as a cure for the problem that they faced with their lack of fear of God. That day would come as wrath and fury and a consuming fire. I'm impressed, and I think that you are too, that how many times in the first chapter God says, I will. I will do this. I will, I will, I will. God is not going to slack up in the things that He has determined that should take place on the corrupt city. And then when we come to the end of the book, we have another series of I wills. But my son will develop that later, I believe. Now, chapter 2 is an exhortation to repentance. The end is described as imminent. And if they are going to be saved, they are going to have to accept the grace of God that is extended to them. And the prophet is very much concerned that they do it immediately. There can't be any waiting around. The day of waiting is past, and the grace that God has extended is being frittered away. He challenges them by reminding them of the nations that He had destroyed before them. And then he comes to chapter 3 and the 7 verses that I want to cover, and we have an indictment on the citizens of Jerusalem for their failure to hear, their disobedience stemming from this lack of fear of the Lord. Now, when we look then at chapter 3 and verse 1, we see the recipients of that judgment. God turns His anger on Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the holy city. God's people were guilty of rebellion and are corrupted in their spiritual livelihood and in their way of life. Their moral soul is corrupt. Perhaps some time has transpired between the warning and the threats given in chapter 1. Perhaps some time has taken place from the time that the prophet gave them that warning about accepting the grace of God while they have opportunity. But now we come into chapter 3, and those threats of judgment have gone unheeded. And the future looks very gloomy indeed. We wonder if those evil men of that time are like those of our modern age, whose only thoughts are on prosperity and materialism, and thinking that God will neither do good or evil, that He will simply remain neutral while they corrupt his will and way. Were they as enamored with materialism as the people of our day? I feel certain that they were. The heart of the nation is described as hardened more than ever. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, the prophet says, "How has the faithful city become a harlot? She that was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Thy silver is become dross, thy wine mixed with water. Thy princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards. They judge not the fatherless, neither doth the cause of the widow come unto them." Jerusalem has had a past like this. Isaiah preached 100 years before Zephaniah. And so in all of that time, even with good kings like Jehoshaphat, who was king during the time that Isaiah began preaching, and then Hezekiah at a time later than that, and then Josiah with all of his good work and reforms, the heart of the people still had not been changed back to God. I wanted to make a point on chapter 1 and verse 1. When Zephaniah traces his lineage back to King Hezekiah and says that he was prophesying in the days of Josiah, I don't think that it's just coincidental that he refers himself to the good kings of the nation. He is in effect saying, I am not really the son of Ammon. I am not the son of Manasseh. I take my roots from Hezekiah, and I join hands with Josiah. And he identifies himself then as the one that is standing with God, like these two great kings. So this polluted and wicked city, an oppressing city, the heart of the nation, then is not changed. And so he says, woe to her. This is the beginning of the funeral dirge that would be sung in the book of Lamentations, that doleful, sad, tragic book that rehearses the sins of Jerusalem that brought her to her knees and prostrated her in the dirt before God. When we see these, the American Standard is the translation that I'm using, by the way. If it reads a little bit different than what you're using, the Old American Standard is what I've used for years in the Old Testament. Jesus said of Jerusalem, when he condemned the city in the New Testament, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that stonest the prophets and killest them that are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy people together as a hen doth her chicks, but ye would not. Jerusalem, that had been God's chosen city, the holy city, the place of Zion, the place of the great temple, was a wicked and oppressing city. There are four failures of the people cited here in verse 2. She obeyed not the voice, that is, the voice of God. Think of the unique position of Israel as far as God was concerned. He said, you obeyed not the voice. They had actually been recipients of those who had heard the voice of God. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai, the people had gathered around the mountain, and the voice of God spoke, and the mountain shook and was filled with smoke, and the people were terrified. They heard the voice, not this particular generation, but Israel, Deuteronomy chapter 4 points out, was the only nation that God ever spoke to directly. The benefit of actually hearing the voice of God speak to that people. But they had forgotten that. And so they heard not the voice. Not only did they forget that God had directly spoken to them, but they had failed to hear the voice of the priesthood. They had failed to hear the voice of the prophets. They had failed to hear the voice of all of her teachers throughout the generations. And that is what had brought them to the position that they were in at this time. She received not correction or instruction. Again, the Lord had chastised them repeatedly through the years. He had chastised them, the unbelieving people in the wilderness. When they went into the land of Canaan, He chastised them by the peoples that they did not drive out of the land. He chastised them throughout the book of Judges as they sinned and were overcome with sin, and then were brought into captivity to the Midianites and to the Moabites and various other ones of their neighbors. So she always proved to be stiff-necked and stubborn, hard-headed, and unable to accept the correction that God tried to give with these things. The next point says she trusted not in Jehovah. Israel and Judah had no faith, no real faith, that is wrapped up in the word trust. If we have real faith, then we are going to trust God. She had no trust in Jehovah. Here they are with Babylon breathing down their necks, that bitter and hasty nation that God is going to raise up to punish them and correct them. But as one of our speakers pointed out yesterday, they could not see over the horizon like the prophet was enabled to do with God's help. But that was waiting for them. And they would not, because of their stubborn and hard hearts and their blind eyes, they could not see the punishment that was awaiting them. I find it fascinating when you study the Old Testament prophets and the books of the Kings and Chronicles, that when Israel or Judah got into trouble, they displayed that they did not trust in God because they called on nations round about them to help. I always liked Isaiah chapter 30 and a few verses in that section there when it talks about those who wanted to go to Egypt for help. In chapter 31 and verse 1, woe to them that go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong. Rather than going to God, they said, let's appeal, let's go to one of these strong nations round about us and take shelter under their wing. In chapter 30, woe to the rebellious children, saith Jehovah, that take counsel, but not by me, and that make a league, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin. Rather than trusting in God, which they did not do, they compounded their sin by calling on somebody else to protect them and give them aid and assistance. They set out to go down to Egypt and have not asked at my mouth to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh and to take refuge in the shadow of Egypt. Isn't this amazing? They had come out of captivity in Egypt, bondage in Egypt after 400 years, and now they want to go right back into the clutches of that nation for protection. You know, and then they had the Assyrian party. They had these political parties in their nations that appealed to the Syrians. Let's go to the Assyrians. Well, the Assyrians were some of the most wicked people that have ever walked on the earth. And that's who they would go to rather than a great and loving and merciful God. In Isaiah 30 and verse 7, for Egypt helps in vain, and to no purpose. Therefore have I called her Rahab that sitteth still. You know what the word Rahab means? Big mouth. Who is Egypt? They are a boastful big mouth that are paper tigers. Egypt's strength had already passed. They could not defend themselves against Assyria. When they came up against Pharaoh Necho, as was pointed out in one of our lessons yesterday, they were whipped soundly at Carchemish by the Babylonians. And here is the Egyptian party of the Jews trying to get help from a nation that could not provide them any strength at all. A paper tiger, a big mouth. She makes her boast, oh, come on down and we'll help you. We'll take you under our wing. We'll protect you in our shadow. But she was an empty nation herself. And so the prophet said, it is a rebellious people, lying children, children that will not hear the law of Jehovah, that say to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things, speak unto us smooth things, prophesy deceits. Isn't that the way of men? Don't tell us how things really are. We don't like to hear the bad things. Smooth it over. Butter us up. Make us feel good. The only way to ward off the disaster was to hear the truth, but they wouldn't listen to the prophets. And the last charge against her, she drew not near to God. This refers to her worship. Her daily sacrifices and burnt offerings were designed to keep Israel close to the Lord. But their hardened, rebellious heart would not allow them to worship properly. Again, from a former prophet, the book of Amos, chapter 5. I despise your feast. I will make no delight, or take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Yea, though you offer me your burnt offerings and meal offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beast. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let justice roll down as righteousness, and as down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. The great prophet Amos. God is not going to accept their worship with their lives like they were. When we look at those who are receiving these indictments, there are particular people that he pointed out. Her princes in the midst of her are roaring lions, her judges, her prophets and priests. And so each one of these are singled out for God's wrath, because as go the leaders of a nation, so goes the nation. And if the head is corrupt, then the body is certainly going to follow that corruption. Homer Haley says these leaders were unfit for the high calling for which they had been appointed or chosen. And so it wasn't the enemy without that was such a large threat. God could take care of them. But it was the enemy within. During World War II, we called it the fifth column. It was that insidious group of people within the nation itself that were ready to capitulate to the enemy rather than fight against it and do everything but do the right thing and coming back to God. These four groups of officials, the princes, judges, prophets, and priests, are singled out in various other passages. Proverbs 28:15 says, "As a roaring lion and a raging bear, so is a wicked ruler over a poor people." I think we have a lot of roaring lions and raging bears in our time. We have fearful days ahead of us, I'm afraid. Politically, we are not any different than Israel and Judah. We have people that are smooth talkers, can make great speeches, but they have no fear of God. I was watching a television a couple days ago, had a panel on there speaking about the candidates running for president, and one of them was ridiculing a candidate who made the remark that she was saved. And he said, she even believes in creation. I guess you know who I'm talking about. What got me, though, this guy spoke with sounded like a British accent. And I got to wondering, is this guy even a citizen of our country? Here he's on a talk show talking about our candidates for president, but he knows nothing of our past. He knows nothing of the foundation principles and that are the underpinning of our nation. The things that Washington and Jefferson and all of our presidents and the signers of the Constitution and the writers of the Declaration of Independence and those that made up our Bill of Rights, all of it is founded in God, not in Allah, not in Buddha, but in Jehovah God, the God of all nations. And that's what made our country strong, and that's what is going to destroy it when we remove ourselves from his care. So her princes are roaring lions. Those who were of royal blood should have been more concerned with the well-being of the citizens in their care. They weren't elected to office, but yet that was their responsibility as princes over the nation. But they were more like beasts than the overseers of God's children. The these politicians in Zephaniah's time are like Satan, roaring lions, walking about, seeking whom they may devour. And so lusting for more prey and filled with avarice and licentiousness. They serve as role models for all of the wicked men who will follow after them. They certainly served as the role models for the Pharisees during the time of Christ. Jesus said they rob widows' houses and cheat them out of their livelihood. And so they suffered that great condemnation of the Lord himself. Stephen said, "As your fathers did, so do ye." Zephaniah went on to say that her judges were evening wolves, wolves that prowl in the evening hours, seeking out that lamb that is the weakest, or that one that is straying away from the herd, the one that is susceptible and vulnerable to attack. How terrible are those who make a pretense of serving God, lusting after more and more prey. Judges, these judges, are judges important? Are judges important today? Are judges going to be even more important in the years that are ahead of us? Are judges important right at this election coming up next week? Absolutely. We put 9 men in black robes on a court and think that they are going to guide the nation. Well, they only guide it the way that their own fickle hearts let them. They are as susceptible to bribes and to false teaching and to a wrong concept of the laws that began our nation. Is abortion going to continue forever? Is infanticide going to be a problem that gets stronger and stronger? Is euthanasia going to be a plague on us in the years to come? Well, if certain judges are appointed, that's certainly the way that it's going to go. When judges of a nation are in cahoots with the criminals, then the citizens are in pretty bad trouble. The prophet talks about his fellow prophets. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons. These are the false prophets, of course. And they are, light is from a word that means vainglorious and boasting. Kyle says it means to boil up or to boil over, and then applied to speaking, to overflow with frivolous words. Saw an advertisement for a fellow starting a ministry in the church. Two of the persons that are joining him in this ministry, their first qualification is they are comedians. Light and treacherous words? Elderships and preachers and congregations, wake up. These are the people that we are turning our youth over to. A youth ministry. And their first qualification, I'm a good comedian. I can make them laugh. Can you teach them about God? Can you teach them what to do to be saved from their sin? Their agenda was to look out for themselves rather than addressing the needs of the people. Brother J.D. Conley is with us. I'll give a quote from his father. Brother Darrell Conley says, "There is no more solemn office than that of serving as a prophet of God. It was never an office that produced ease and popularity for the faithful prophet. It was a thankless task. It required the public condemnation of sin in the lowly and in the mighty. It required calling an often heedless people back to their God. It often cost the prophet his life. But there were many false prophets, as there are false preachers today. They were always ready to speak smooth things and prophesy lies." Zephaniah said her priest profaned the sanctuary and violated the law. To profane something is to make it common and take away its sacredness. Something that is holy, something that God has said is holy, is to make it so common and treat it with such contempt that it is no longer sacred, that it is no longer holy. It's profane. So they profaned the sanctuary. I don't know exactly what the prophet had in mind. The sanctuary was the temple and their ministrations in the temple. But they did violence to the law by perverting it. Jesus said of the Pharisees of his day, "In vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." That hasn't changed. False priests are still active. Think about our own self-appointed change agent priests. They are our brothers. They are priests. But they are busy changing the history of our brotherhood, changing the worship of the church, changing the plan of salvation, reducing Christ to simply a man, and thus they pervert the law of God. God cannot be honored unless his law is honored. It is the ultimate crime to fail to obey the Creator when he speaks. In verses 5 through 7, I need to hurry along. He talks about her princes and judges and prophets and priests, and then he said, Jehovah in the midst of her is righteous. He will not do iniquity. Every morning doth he bring his justice to light. He fails not, but the unjust know no shame. 4 things I'd like to say about this every morning thing. God's judgment is brought to light every morning. I think that this has a reference to the sacrifices that were made morning and evening from the beginning of Israel's history. From the time of the giving of the law, they were prescribed to offer sacrifices morning and evening in the tabernacle and temple. These daily ministrations that were as certain as the rising and the setting of the sun should have reminded them of their sinful condition and to make them humble before God, but it did not. In the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews said, and every priest stands daily ministering and offering oft times the same sacrifices. And so over and over and over and over for 1,500 years, daily sacrifices were being made, reminding them, I am sinful. I need God's help. I need God's mercy. I need his grace. I can't be saved without him. But it's simply got to be just a rite and a ritual and an old habit. In the second place, as each morning the rising sun sheds its light on the world, so too each morning, day by day, God dispensed his justice. God in the midst of her, Jehovah in the midst of her, is just. He is righteous. And so every day God would dispense his justice, rewarding the good and punishing evil through his those who were the dispensers of the law, the judges and the priests and so on. But also through his providence. God's justice is ministered daily, even today, through his providence and by those who are the official leaders of nations and people. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. Lamentations 3:22 and 23. Number 3, his mercy is seen every morning. When it talks about this wicked people, it says that they rose up early. Well, God was already ahead of them. He rose up his prophets early and sent them, he said. God was not late in getting the word to these people. It wasn't that God was lacking in diligence to know what was going on. He wasn't sitting back on a cloud like an old man dozing. God was on his throne. God in the midst of her is righteous. He was in the midst of them and knew exactly what was going on. And so, by the nations of Assyria that carried away Israel and scattered them among the nations, by Babylon that would take them into captivity for 70 years, God dispensed his mercy, and even those captivities was merciful, because he could have brought them to an end like he did the Philistines, like he did Moab and Edom, but he did not do that. And number 4, just as his mercy and justice are dispensed every morning and every day, so is the testimony of God's existence. The beautiful Psalm 19, the first couple verses. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. Their line has gone out. There is no end of the instruction of God by nature, day after day after day, night after night after night, from creation till this very moment. Everything about nature teaches us God is. God exists. They declare his glory, and so does his law. God, through the prophet, reminds them of his justice meted out on foreign nations. And that ought to have caused Israel to take heed, but it didn't. I said, only fear thou me, receive instruction. The message wasn't technical. It wasn't hard to decipher and understand. It wasn't drawn out and difficult. It was like Isaiah was trying to teach in Isaiah 28. Precept upon precept, line upon line upon line, here a little, there a little. And you know what the people said? What are you doing, teaching us the ABCs? We're grown men. We don't need that kind of doctrine. We don't need that kind of teaching. This same old first principles over and over and over again. And so the prophet said, you will hear the word of God, precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line upon line, here a little, there a little, but you will learn it with a foreign tongue when the Assyrians come and take you away. What's it going to take for us? God's message has always been quite simple. Micah said, he hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. But yet Hosea had to write, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Well, I'm going to quit. It's 10 minutes till. And I know you need a break. Thank you for your good attention this morning, and we'll turn over to Denver.